Hello, friends. Henry Flowers here, Powerful Living Outreach Ministries. Got a really special guest for you today. My friend, my fellow minister, Mr. Sherman Bradley.
Good day,
What's going
sir.
on, my brother?
Hey, it's a beautiful day.
I was excited to get your podcast information and your logo. You sent a couple of things to me. And I said, look at my brother trying to do this thing on a high level.
Well, that's the hope.
But that's the goal, because been in music for a long time, and then getting into crossing over into videos and things like that is just too many times you see just a lack of professionalism.
Yes.
People really want a product, and especially the people of God. Oh, God called me. It's just Jesus, and I just love him so much. There's a whole thing to be said about being professional in your presentation of a product that you, especially if you want people to invest their time in and invest their money in. And when I saw your logo, it just made me smile. So tell me about your media group and your hopes and thoughts about your podcast.
Well, the plan is to take what's called ShermSpeaks, one word, my first name being Sherman, and as one word, that along with the logo of a microphone is what's going to be the production company for the things that I want to do, all things communication. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, the podcast. And ShermSpeaks is probably just going to be the producing. I'm thinking of calling the podcast Good Grief, because my goal is to really tap into the hearts of people who may or may not know that they're challenged by grief and loss, and to understand that grief does not only apply itself to loss of life, whether it's a pet or someone close to you, but grief can come from losing something that's just very valuable to you. And you go through this emotional place and state that requires some introspection, requires some self-awareness and some honesty about what it is that you've lost. It can be divorce, it could be a friendship, it could be a job, it could be a prized possession, it could be you've had a natural disaster of some sort and it has taken some things out. It could have been a vacation you planned for 2 years and then COVID happened and you couldn't take it. You lost the money.
Yeah.
Whatever the case may be.
And or other things that you've lost.
Other things that you've lost. There is a real emotional challenge that comes in these moments that require our authenticity with ourselves. And most people, I find, just try to wash over it. They suppress it. They don't actually delve into it. They don't ask themselves questions. There isn't any time meditating or journaling regarding what it is that they've lost and why they feel what they feel. They just attempt to move on and press on, but that just lingers. That is not the healthiest approach to navigating loss. So I want to begin to unpack that on the podcast. And there'll be some interviewing of people who've gone through loss on a various and variety of spectrums that you'll get to hear their personal stories of their challenges. Some who are in it, some who have come through it, some who may have aha moments in the middle of it and realize, this was a little more, let's say, pertinent than I thought it was going to be once we begin to unpack it.
So you're talking about grief and in this aspect, because good grief, like that suggests a lot that is not necessarily there for some people, because other people say, well, what's the good that comes out of grief, or talking about it, especially? Because am I in need of counseling through this? Is it okay to just share this with the brothers or sisters that's close to me? Like how in depth, who to trust, right? And then all of these things that are involved with grief. So give me your thoughts on these levels of grief being good.
So very valid questions. And it is important to be able to categorize and compartmentalize so that you can then answer those questions more intellectually. When you think of, we'll start with the major one that people will identify with, and that's when I've lost a loved one. There's a grieving process that we go through, even though we have a tendency to not walk it through or be intentional regarding it. Most will acknowledge it is grief. If you lost a pet, you may not, some people will say, I'm not grieving that. I lost it. It was a pet. I loved it. I feel a certain way. But they may not associate themselves with grieving or needing to process that grief. And then there are some who will have, for instance, 9/11. There were people who didn't know any of those 3,000 plus people that died, but they went to see counseling afterwards because their sensibilities, the way that they saw society and life as a whole changed drastically.
I remember where I was. I remember the day.
Yes.
I was a carpet cleaner for Service Master, and the ladies whose carpet I was cleaning, we grieved together in that moment.
I had just left. I was on my way home from God's Bible College. I walked in the door to the news and it's showing it. Nobody told me. I did not hear it when it had happened. I was seeing the replay on television because I was en route home. I remember that vividly as well. And those moments that are monumental in that regard require us to do some unpacking. And it may require, more than likely will require, somebody who's a professional who can assist us unpacking what we feel and why we feel what we're feeling. Let me give you a personal story. The most difficult loss that I can recall is probably my mother. My grandmother was challenging as well, but I didn't properly handle that one. But it wasn't as deep. There was no wound. It was just the love loss. My mother's death was a wound, not just a loss, because it was an unhealthy relationship that we both had desires for it being healthier, but neither one of us knew how to obtain that. So her loss left me with not only grief, but it left me with regrets and shame. The day I buried my mother, a friend of mine called and apologized for not being able to make the funeral. That was a Friday afternoon. That Sunday, he committed suicide. He's gone. I haven't grieved my mother. I'm going to do his funeral several weeks later. I think it was on February 12th, because that's my grandmother's birthday. It was a Monday, if I remember correctly. It was the year because that Sunday was Super Bowl Sunday and the Philadelphia Eagles won. I can remember these very tangible things in my experience as I'm dealing with the grief and loss of two people now. Mm-hmm. It was less than 3 months later that my mother-in-law died. I've not dealt with the grief of my mother or my friend in any manner that would allow me to have to deal with the grief of my mother-in-law passing, who I loved and who now my wife is in grief. And we're both grieving, and we're both trying to navigate one another's grief. And in it, it's just cloudy. It's messy. But because I had not really dealt with significantly the unhealthy nature of the relationship between me and my mother and what we both had longed for, that we could never come together on to build something that we would feel more confident and appreciative of, I carried that weight after she left. And I wasn't aware of how big a weight it was. But I was feeling grief in ways that was hitting me in the most unopportune times. Standing in line at the grocery store, and I'm just overwhelmed with grief and loss and anxiety, and I begin to cry, and I don't understand why I'm feeling this so heavily.
You got no idea what's happening.
I was sitting,
and it's in real time.
It's in real time. I was sitting on a plane, and my wife is next to me. We're on our way to California. I'll never forget this. We were going to Oakland, and I just felt, she was asleep, so I didn't bother her, but I just felt this overwhelming grief, and I'm sitting on a plane with all these people around, and I'm just crying. And I don't understand why, and I don't want to.
So, wait, you don't want to be a grown man crying in front of uncontrollably?
Not just because other people are around. I don't want to feel the weight of what I'm feeling that I can't fully comprehend, that I'm starting to get inklings of. I know it's connected to what I wanted that never came to be, but the fact that it is now unable to be obtained was a part of the process that I did not have an answer to. Couple that with that cannot fix, now that she's gone, what I had hopes for that I had suppressed. Now those hopes that were suppressed come to the surface, but they come to the surface with no way to know how to actually navigate them. If that wasn't enough, that same year, because my mother died in January, my friend died the first week of February. We buried him, I think it was February 12th. My mother-in-law dies in May.
Now, I need y'all to understand something here, because in addition to what happened that year, because you're about to tell me something else. Now, I need everybody to understand here that all of these things are happening in his life while he and his wife are both knee-deep in church planting, launching a ministry again for the really the second, all of these things you went through with the UMC, like this is all that time.
Well, this is 2018, and then 2019 is when we started engaging with the UMC. But we were pastoring, and I continued to pastor. There were times my wife challenged me that maybe I needed to step away for a while, but I refused because that was my life source. That gave me, because I'm a communicator. That's my passion. It's my purpose, whether it's a pulpit or it's some other platform or it's the street corner. That's just who I am. Whether it is in poetry or it's in authoring or it's on a podcast or it's just one-on-ones with somebody that I'm inspiring and pouring into, it's just in my DNA.
That's his strong suit.
Correct.
Now, remember, my Powerful Living partners, because we talk about this thoroughly, about your strong suit. And your strong suit is a good thing, but just understand your strong suit can be hypermetabolic. Like it consumes you, you consume it. It's a weird kind of relationship. So all of this stuff is happening, and while you're in ministry and doing these things, see, so if you were struggling with it, how does the average person, because you're about to tell us something else that happened.
Yeah.
How do we create these opportunities? Because if it was weighing on you that way, what about the average parishioner who doesn't have?
Yeah, this is why counseling is important. And this is why I went through ultimately a small group, what's called Grief Share, small group program. That's 13 weeks that in a very detailed and structured manner unpacks what grief looks like and what God's process for helping us heal if we'll engage it, if we'll accept the invitation into his loving arms where he wants to nurture us and comfort us in our time of grief. Mm-hmm. That's a process that one has to be intentional with and must understand outside of themselves, because there were things that I did not want to delve into. There were things that were difficult to process through. There were realizations I had to come to grips with. I got asked the first time in a way that I actually listened, because it's probably not the first time it was presented to me, but I got asked, what do I think my mother's life was without her mother, who died when she was a teenager? Because I had never asked myself that in conjunction with my frustrations of what kind of mother she was or wasn't to me. I only looked at me and what my issues were with her and the challenges I faced and the things that disappointed me. I never ventured into her history, because I was like 3 years of age when my grandmother died. So I don't know her. I didn't get to meet her. I didn't have any kind of connection to recall or think about what kind of person she was. That absentee just left her as somebody I never knew. Don't even have pictures of. Can't even remember what she looks like visually. But when it came to processing grief, this was one thing that I had to do, and it was very painful, because the things that were coming to me and some of the people that I began to ask questions of talked about how my grandfather was a very tough and stern individual. And I remember him being a tough and stern individual. He wasn't a big emoter. You walked on eggshells around him, and that was the nature of the family without a mother. And my mother's oldest sister, my aunt, kind of took on the motherly role, but then she died when I was like 19 or 20. I was in the military. I had to come back from Europe to Cincinnati for her funeral. So now there's that grief and loss. And I had to process and begin to forgive myself and forgive my mother for all of the anxiety and disappointments that I had, and then for the regrets and shame that I felt about myself and the fact that I couldn't fix it. But I couldn't do that on my own. I had to do that with counseling. And I fought it for a while. And there was too much going on in my life. What I just shared with you was the first 5 months of 2018. But also in 2018, we bought a home and moved into it and staged the home with our stuff before we moved into the new one. Somebody wanted to buy it. We move out, take all of our stuff, get into our new home, and this person's decides he wants to switch from a conventional to a VA loan, and a VA loan has different criteria, and he hadn't met the criteria, and he wanted us to wait another month. We didn't have time to wait.
Yeah, just sit back and wait while he gets his stuff figured out.
No. We didn't have time to wait. This was the one thing I'm thinking is a positive thing that's happening in this year with all of this grief and loss that I've had. So to have this put to a halt, and I have to put the house back on the market, and now there's nothing in the house, so I have to restage the house to get others to view the house, and now I'm paying 2 house notes. It was 4 months later before we got that house sold, and we had to put several $1,000s into it because the next potential buyer wanted a few things changed.
Shocker.
Yeah. So now I'm dealing with that. At the same time, I got a call. This is the second stint. I got a call from one of my lovely children that she was incarcerated, has a substance abuse issue. And this was the second trip. And the first half, what I forgot to mention in between my mother's death and my mother-in-law's death, is that my daughter calls me from jail. Second half of 2018, she gets in again, and I go see her. I thought I was going to see her, mind you. I went all the way to Denver, Colorado to see her. And you don't get to go into the building, and you don't get to sit face to face. They didn't tell me this on the phone. There's a building across the street, and you get to sit in front of a black and white monitor connected to other monitors where you got a little elbow room, but you could reach out and touch the next person who's also on a monitor talking to whoever they're talking to behind bars. That's how impersonal it was. That's how the lack of privacy went.
That's amazing.
And it was 28 minutes is all you get.
And you traveled how far for that?
All the way up to Denver.
And you had no idea?
I had no idea. They didn't tell me that on the phone. They just told me the location, where to go, what I needed to do to register. They didn't tell me it was in another building and I wasn't going to get to see her face to face. So I go there, I do that in the midst of having these 2 house notes I'm paying while still navigating this thing called grief. And finally, in counseling and in small group, such that I am actively engaging it, but stuff is still happening. Because at the same time, there was a gentleman we went into a deal with, real estate, who, let's just say, I don't even know the details of what happened. I just know we lost a large sum of money, and that individual shortly after that moved his whole family out of state, out west. All this is happening in 2018. Then I go back out to Denver when it's time for my daughter to be released, to literally walk her out of her incarceration and spend a week attempting to get her into rehab, with no success for a variety of different reasons. This is all on the heels of I spent from the time that I visited her to the time that I went to get her. It's like 6 weeks later, I spent time on the phone with Denver's correctional institutions trying to get them to release her to Ohio parole from Denver's parole. They wouldn't do it. I had already had a program lined up here in the city that she could attend. I had all the documentation, and everything I needed, but they wouldn't release her. They justified it based upon the level of misdemeanor that she had for why she was incarcerated, wouldn't allow them to release her to another state, to her father, to go through rehab. Mind you, at that time, I was running a drug rehab program for men. So I'm faced with trying to get her to rehab, and I can't. So I can't find a place. So the place that had the closest available opening in the not too distant future, we put her up in a hotel across the street from it.
Mm-hmm.
It was barely 48 hours later, I got a call, and she's got a hold of bad dope, and she's in the hospital.
Oh, no.
And I have to rush back out there. And I sit with her for a day and a half or 2 days as she's in there recovering. And fortunately, she would. But all this is transpiring in 2018. And it was that December that I was on the phone with a friend of mine. And he said to me, Sherman, you might be depressed. And I was like, no, I'm not depressed. Matter of fact, you know what? I hadn't even started.
Not even possible.
You know what? I hadn't even started. Let me step back. I had not even started the grief course yet. And I hadn't started counseling yet. It wasn't until he mentioned to me, you might be depressed, that I began to think about it for the first time. Because I'm like, I'm an optimistic person. I don't get depressed. That's never happened before in my life. And that was the first inkling. The second inkling was my wife mentioned it right before we went on vacation. And I thought, no. And so she's like, you need to call a friend of ours who's retired psychologist. Just call her and have a conversation with her. I was like, all right, fine. I will call her. I talked to her. I'll call her. So I called her. And she was like, Sherman, you're not only depressed, you need to take medication. I was like, the devil is a lie. I might be depressed, but I ain't taking no medication. What else can I do?
Right, because see, this is where, oh my gosh, see, we can have so many conversations about this where we don't allow these kinds of possibilities in the body of Christ. No, I'm not depressed. I have the mind of Christ. I'm not medication. Man, listen. Physicians, heal yourselves. I trust God for all of my healing. He is my medicine.
Yeah. Now,
this is what we do.
Now, let me say this. While I wasn't going to take medication because I believed exactly what you said for myself, and I was determined I was going to do whatever I needed to do to not have to do medication, because I believed that there was a process I could go through that was with help outside of myself, as much as I would get help from God himself, as I would draw into what does grief look like and what does God want me to know from it. Some of that came from what I would read in the Bible. Some of that came from this one-on-one counseling. Some of it came from this small group session that I went through. All three of these components and my own willingness were necessary to get to that end result, physician, heal thyself. Now, I will say that I will not say that nobody needs medication, because I've seen some folk who have been in depression for so long, it has altered the chemical makeup of how their brain functions, because this brain is a muscle. And you can overly think yourself into a disruption of what is the normal process for how the brain is supposed to function. And there has been proof that you can help with the assistance of righting some of that damage with certain kinds of medication, not for the longevity, but for a process. Now, that means the other work has to still happen as well. It's not just the medication. We don't do medication for medication's sake as an avoidance to the work that has to be done internally in one's mind about how one got into the predicament that they're in the first place. But I do believe there are some folk who will have to go through that. I just didn't believe I needed it, and I knew there was a process I could incorporate, and I knew I had a level of faith to say that I'll work through this, and I did. And I am a living example of being able to come out of that, because I hit a wall, and I hit a wall so hard that my body started revealing to me, even after I had begun these courses of correction through shingles.
Oh, boy.
Now, I suspect some of this was also in conjunction to, because shingles didn't happen until 2020 or 2021. I can't remember. But it took
from
me,
what I hear.
It took me all of 2019 to work through what 2018 was. It took me, and I thought I was coming out in 2020 until COVID hit. And then I realized there was more that I needed to unpack, because there was other issues of loss that were taking place and compounding the losses and grief that I was feeling from getting through these three people that I loved and my daughter's challenges. So I did get her out, to finish the story, after the hospital. We did get out, and we did, before I came back to Cincinnati, find a place to enroll her in. and she did go through rehab, and she was doing well for quite some time. But all of that in 2018 was just a weight I have never felt before in my life and never want to feel ever again. And a challenge that I had to endure that still feels fresh today because of how deep the wound was and how far I had to go to process truth to the lies I had believed, such that I could be free of the baggage of shame and guilt and regrets. Because regrets is ruminating on the grief over and over and over again, not letting it go, not allowing oneself to process through such that you can exhale, cast that burden before the throne and leave it there. Let it be burned up in the fire of your worship and your praise and your acceptance of God and who you are in Him, rather than the weight of the identity that gets shifted when we allow those things that have happened, and regrets and loss and disappointment, to reshape our thinking about ourselves.
In your experience, how would you measure how we as ministers possibly have failed our followers in this area?
Well, we don't talk about the nuances of grief and loss. Grief is typically connected to death of some kind. And then we'll delve into it, but I don't know how deep we actually delve into it. It's not a popular subject. It's not one somebody's going to come to you and say more times than not, will you do a study on grief and death and loss? They might do one on heaven, but rarely is it about grief and loss. And when we do, we may just do a series on it, and it may cover 2, 3, or 4 weeks, and then we move on because there are so many other topics we have to address. But in every church, there ought to be what's called grief share. There ought to be this course that I went through, 13-week small group, where everyone who's had some kind of grief or loss should go through, because it will enlighten you to what God says regarding it and how to not get stuck in it, and why it's important to avail yourself to the truths that are connected to it, because oftentimes we allow things to linger we're not consciously aware of. But it affects how we see life, it affects how we see death, it affects how we see relationships. And that's very important to our walk of faith.
So I'm going to have that information, because I'm going to get it from you, about this grief share class, and we'll put it in the description box and see what we can do to make that available to as many as possible. And I went through
twice. Let me make that clear. That first 13 weeks, I was numb for most of it. And the difficulty for me was that I was in a group of about 8. I was the only minority for one. I wound up being the only male because the other 2 males dropped out. And I'm in there with all women who really deeply longed for the return of the person that they lost. I was the only one in there who didn't have a healthy relationship with the person that they lost and was grieving the difficulties of that. Everybody else had these loving relationships and stories that they would tell, and all the fun that they had and all those experiences. I didn't have that story. And so I'm sitting there listening every session to all of these positive experiences, and I'm sitting there with one that wasn't positive, and I'm trying to make sense of it all, and how in the world am I supposed to value myself as a good person when I couldn't even have a healthy relationship with my biological mother? And I got these women in there talking about relationships they're having with their husbands or their children who they've lost, and how healthy it was, and how they miss them, and how they long for this. I didn't really have a longing for, I just had a longing for a different story.
So you couldn't even relate.
I couldn't even relate the first time. I was just numb in there. I'm being hit with all these stories and information. There's wonderful material, wonderful stories. They interviewed tons of people. Every week there were multiple interviews with people and their challenges of how they navigated through grief, how they got stuck or how they came out, and what had to happen, what kind of resources and support that they needed in order to come out, how long it took, how short it was, so on and so forth. But me, that first 13 weeks, man, I was just like, I know I need this. I know I have to be here. You can't quit. You can't run. You got to ingest this. You got to digest this. You got to think. You got the workbook. You got, I do the work, and then I might skip a week, and then I got 2 weeks in a row, because it was a lot to take in. I had a lot of loss and death in 2020 in 2018. And
While
so,
your full-time ministry,
while
you're
full-time ministry,
got everything going on with your personal.
while my wife is grieving from the loss of her mother and some of the dysfunction she went through with remaining family members who rejected her. So she's got her own grief. So I'm also trying to hold her up in this process as well. And it was catastrophic. It was nightmares. So I wound up with, and then when COVID happens and the race relations stuff is happening during COVID, and we got folks in the street and riots, we got the anxiety, and I got people coming to me because I'm a pastor wanting answers I don't have and wanting to talk about stuff, and then people's ignorances and biases are revealing themselves who may not have revealed them previously because they don't fully understand this whole George Floyd thing, or Breonna, or Ahmaud Arbery, yeah, these are some of the prominent ones in that time frame. And that's stress. That's a weight to carry, to have to be viewed as someone who's supposed to have answers. And
you're leading this because one of my first connections with you was at the Mosaics event. And y'all just understand it's heavy.
Yes.
Heavy.
Yes. This was not new to my life, in other words, when these things, because I can go back to 2001 when I was with Pastor Damon Lynch at New Prospect before the riots took place. We were there burying the males, some of the males who had died at the hands of the police before 2001 and the uprising took place. So I've always Timothy Thomas was the spark for that, but there were like 13 unarmed over the course of like 4 or 5 years. That was the impetus to this implosion in the city. And so I've been accustomed and been involved, but this timing was on top of all the things that were going on with my life personally, just made it a tremendous weight to try to carry. And I needed to get help and support in order to do so.
What's going to be your hope for your upcoming podcast, Good Grief? And I'm definitely going to do what I can to help you get reach and spread the word about it. What's going to be your hope for your podcast? Let's just say the first 30 to 60 days of your podcast launch.
That's a very good question. Ultimately, I want folk to know my personal story in this. So I am a practitioner through experience. I'm not just someone pontificating out here because it's a subject matter I think is important. I'm launched into this because of what I went through, because I was not prepared. I did not understand grief. I had not done any work in the grief category of any magnitude, and it literally knocked me off my feet. And it is only the grace of God that I could stand in pulpits and attempt to continue to lead. I don't know how well I was doing that, but I know the people loved me enough to allow me to be me and go through that. And even though my wife at times wanted me to step away from it, it was my source of strength. It was my lifeblood, my preparing and reading and studying and going before the Lord to deliver and walk in the truth of the role that I'm called and purposed to do is life-giving for me. And to be in grief and lose that at the same time just felt like too much for me. I would recommend that for everybody. Everybody's got to look at their individual temperament, what their capability is, how deep the wounds are, what other resources are they utilizing to get help and support. So I'm not saying this is a way that everybody should go through it, but it helped for me. And I want to unpack the story. I want to bring in folk to interview who will tell their stories, and we get to dialogue about their challenges, and we get to speak into the audience about where to get help, who to get help, how to go about it, how to see the warning signs, what to begin to prepare yourself for if you're someone who's living with somebody who's grieving and you're not the one with the direct loss, but you're trying to navigate this difficult world with them when they won't go get the help that they need. And there's a variety of different things that we can continue to unpack on this subject matter to help people out there who are struggling. And not just the loss of death. From death. We want to really tap into people to help them better understand how to navigate losses that were important that we typically don't really give credence to. We typically just suppress and move on to the next thing, or the next person, or the next job, or the next hobby. You know, when I tore my ACL on a basketball court, I was like 41 years of age. I've been playing basketball since I was little. I quit after that, literally. I didn't pick a ball up for years because one, I didn't want to go through that rehab again, and I didn't want to deal with the whole insurance issue again. And I picked up something else. I picked up golf instead. Nobody's going to hit me on the golf course.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I don't have to leave my feet on a golf course.
Okay.
And so being willing to make drastic changes is not something I've ever been afraid of, but I find many people are, or they'll make drastic changes to avoid something, not out of a place of growth and development and healing, but out of a place of suppression and avoidance. And so we want to bring some of these things to the surface to try to help people who may not know they're grieving the loss of a community or a job or a friendship in a way that's more impactful to them than they're willing to give credence to, because it hurts. And there may be some guilt involved. There may be some regrets involved. There may be some shame involved. And we don't typically allow ourselves a healthy way of walking through that. We typically medicate or suppress and move on, but we carry that baggage with us into the next relationship.
Yeah.
And we only compound the next grieving situation when that one doesn't work as well.
This is where it comes into play, where we talk about the strong suit. And in many different areas of our lives, when I show up in a room, I automatically put on my strong suit, whether it's being funny or singing or speaking, whatever your gift is, you put on the strong suit. And it can happen that many times we use the strong suit to protect others from seeing who we really are. We're constantly trying to look good and trying to be right and not look bad. And these are the things that society has told us that we ought to be over and over again. So I appreciate your desire for being willing to step up and say, hey, listen, this is my story. Because the authenticity part of this whole dialogue is huge.
Yeah. And we have to unpack the fact that there are stages of grief as well. Some say 5, some say 7, but we'll unpack these stages so folk can understand. There is no cookie cutter process to grieving. Each person is going to experience differently, and each person needs to be allowed to experience it differently. But then we also got to look at the other side of this coin. People say some of the stupidest things to people grieving. And they try to make statements to move them out of grieving. Or they try to put some kind of Christianese on the grieving instead of allowing people to be in the messiness of it because you've lost someone or something very near and dear to you.
God had a better plan. Your child is now in heaven. Your child's in a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. But that realization takes time for someone to internalize, to process, and they may never be good with it, but they can go on from it. Because some folk want an expiration date on grief, and it can linger. Some folk won't give it up, and it'll shut down their quality of life because they won't come out of the grieving. Some think that if I'm not grieving, then I'm not respecting the loss. I didn't really love the person that died. No, you can do both. You can walk out of it and walk into the fullness of who you've been created to do, because like you said, God is sovereign. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. As he chooses to do, he's going to do. And it's going to work together for the good of those that love him and for those who are called according to his purpose. So the question becomes, then, what do you believe? But that's not that's not top of mind when you're in the thrones of grief and loss. You're thinking about what you're missing and how well it was or how bad it was, whatever the case may be. And it takes time to walk through that and not be so reminded of it or processing it in ways that may cause time in ways that without it, with them here, you would never have to invest. And so that's very real.
Wow. I'm looking forward to hearing more. Definitely looking forward to being a part of your ministry as well. I do know that there is some good grief that needs to occur in my life as it relates to my never having a rock solid relationship with my father. You know, someone called me the other day, asked me about my father. How was my father? And it says, well, my dad is up there in age. I think my dad is going to be, let's see, he's, was he 19 years older than, or something older than my mother? So my dad is probably going to be about 88 or 86 somewhere this year. And they called saying that my dad was in the hospital, COPD, things like that. And I just began to think about him. And I sat with it for a minute because there was something that was not in my heart that I thought should be there. And I just had to sit with a moment of sadness saying, you know, if this is the time that my dad passes away, I think I'm going to grieve because I won't grieve. I won't have anything to grieve because I don't have any other, my daddy always, right? My daddy used to, no man, I told this story from the platform a couple of times. I used to go out there and play catch with my dad. I'd throw the ball and the ball would never come back because he was never there. And that's grief that I know I may not even have the capacity to deal with that loss, that missing part of my life until after he's gone.
Yeah, that's real. You know, the last point I'll make is someone once said, I can't miss anything I never had. And I disagree with that wholeheartedly.
Is that what someone said?
And there are people who believe that, especially as it relates to relationships. And since biologically you have a male and a female parent, your DNA is interrelated to their DNA. You have likenesses because they are the parts of you that create you.
Absolutely.
So even in the context of what God intended relationally, where two wait until marriage, conceive and have this child and are married, they've created a covenant bond that as they love on this child, the child is becoming well-rounded psychologically, emotionally, and physically by healthy care of two loving parents. You remove one, you've removed that part of the equation. Now, mom can attempt to be both, but mom isn't both. She'll do the very best she can, but there's a void that's missing that was the original intent. And anytime you do not have the original intent of something operating, misuse is occurring. We don't like to call it abuse, but it is abuse anytime you misuse something outside of its intended purpose. The intended purpose of coming together is for procreation. Yes, there's pleasure attached to it, but the goal is to continue to propagate the earth with humanity. Well, we've created other goals for this coming together without that, such that we don't have to be married to do that. We don't have to be in covenant arrangement. We have to be in covenant agreement, and we can have multiple partners, failing to realize that we're connecting our DNA, we're transferring fluids every time, and we're creating dysfunctions because we're operating outside of the original intent. Now you couple this with there's loss when there's only one parent there. That loss is typically not designed or not presented in a way that you need to grieve it. They just matter-of-factly, it is what it is. You only had one parent. Or maybe there's a surrogate somewhere. Maybe you had an uncle who stepped in. Maybe you had a next-door neighbor that stepped in. Maybe you had a coach that stepped in. And we go on with that. But there needs to be a healthy grieving of that. There were expectations, even if it's just what you saw modeled in the community that you lived in by children who had their actual biological father in the family. It gives you a inference of what could have been. And there's always a sense of loss in that as you go through, because there's certain things you're going to miss out on. Like you said, you're throwing a ball and there's no dad on the other end to catch it and throw it back. That's a loss. There's grieving that comes in that, because there's a natural DNA, psychological, physical, and emotional connection even when there's an absence. And that must be walked through and processed through such that you can be healthier going forward, especially as you're going to take on a role one day of being a father. And how is that going to play itself out? Are you going to overly engage yourself and involve yourself in the life because you had no one in your life and you had no one to step in and be a surrogate? Or are you void of what you don't know because you just don't know? And are you too proud to go get assistance with what you don't know because you never had a father to teach you so that you could be the best father you need to be? We typically just tough it out. That's what we do as men. We're rarely going to ask for help in ways that are going to be uncomfortable to us if it means we're going to have to do some reflecting on some very painful things in the process of getting this help. And we don't typically we typically like to tell help how to help us on top of it. Yeah. So you got to be the kind of help I want to help me if I'm going to ask you for help. And that's oftentimes not the totality of the help that we need. And oftentimes it's not the depth of the help that we need. And so these are natural dynamics that operate relationally that we have to give more credence to so that we can be healthier for whatever is next in our lives.
What he said. Henry Flowers, Powerful Living Outreach Ministries. Listen, y'all want to subscribe and make sure you turn on notifications, because when this brother's ministry gets launched, I want to be able to give you an opportunity to be a part of it as well, because we got some good things to unpack and uncover for the sake of everybody involved.
And if you're local, you can find us in Finneytown. If you're in Cincinnati, Ohio, where our church, The Warehouse, operates on Sunday mornings, 10 a.m., 691 Fleming Road. We'd love to see you there.
Henry Flowers here with Pastor Sherman Bradley. Looking forward to his podcast, Good Grief.
Yeah.
Man, y'all need to be ready. It's about to go down in Jesus' name.
Amen.
I ain't going nowhere. Coming back.